Welcome to www.ilovehistory.co.uk. Think, question, understand.
How far did the popularity and effectiveness of Elizabeth's government decline after 1588? Remember that popularity and effectiveness are not the same thing. However, there is no doubt that the two things are linked together. It is generally easier to be popular if you're effective, and vice versa. Let's start by considering the Spanish War. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 has been described by Starkey as the zenith of Elizabeth's reign. It was the high point of Elizabeth's popularity and effectiveness. In the Tilbury speech, Elizabeth set out to her army her strength as a Tudor king. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." The destruction of almost half of Spain's mighty armada cemented the image of a queen married to her country and protecting Protestantism. In this role, God was demonstrably on her side. A commemorative medal struck afterwards stated, "God's winds blew and they were scattered," while the Armada portrait gives us one of the most famous representations of the Queen in victory. However, the success also sowed the seeds for many of the problems of her final years. The war destroyed her financial policy of reducing expenditure. The Spanish War cost over £4 million. She was forced to ask for multiple subsidies, extend ship money to inland counties, sell crown lands, use forced loans and purveyance. The strain of the war on the country's economy was important in the unrest of the 1590s. Moreover, her conduct of the war was cautious, and she failed to follow up on successes in 1588 and 1596. Nevertheless, she died with England secure, Ireland controlled, and an independent Protestant Netherlands. Another factor to consider is the Irish Rebellion. Ireland had been a problem for English kings since the Middle Ages. It was too big to conquer, but too close to ignore. England only really had direct control over the Pale, the area around Dublin. The problems after 1588 were underpinned by the Spanish War. Ireland was a base for possible invasion, especially as its population was Catholic and therefore sympathetic to Spain. The Earl of Tyrone led a rebellion against Elizabeth from 1598 to 1601. This was a well-organised uprising, and 1,200 English soldiers were killed by the rebels at the Battle of Yellow Ford. The Earl of Essex was sent with 16,000 soldiers to quell the rebellion. This was the largest force to leave England during Elizabeth's reign. Essex's command was one of disaster and disobedience. He made many knights against Elizabeth's orders. He avoided battle, lost 12,000 men to disease and desertion. He signed a secret truce with the Earl of Tyrone and returned to England without permission. Essex's failures are powerful evidence for the ineffectiveness of Elizabeth's government after 1588. However, by 1601, Essex's replacement, Mountjoy, had defeated the rebellion and the Spanish troops who had been landed in Kinsale. Mountjoy went on to secure control with a brutal, scorched earth policy. Spencer said at the time that he left the Irish like ghosts crying out of their graves. Nevertheless, this was a short-term victory. Mountjoy's actions, like the earlier policy of plantations, where huge areas of land were taken off of Irish landowners and given to English Protestants, created a bitter hatred of the English that would fuel conflict for a further 400 years. The Irish Rebellion was also hugely expensive. In 1600, £320,000 of Elizabeth's £460,000 expenditure went on Ireland. Relations with Parliament also presented challenges for Elizabeth. The key example of the difficulties with Parliament is the monopolies crisis of 1601. See the notes on Key Question 5 for more detailed examples. Key points to make here are that the abuse of monopolies had come about because of the financial pressures of the Spanish War. Her abuse of monopolies was a product of her failure to reform and her disregard for the impact of her policies on the wider economy. The monopolies crisis represented a serious challenge to Elizabeth's authority, but ultimately serves as an example of how her traditional methods and imagery, although tired, still worked. The golden speech she made to Parliament was effective, and much of the anger was focused at her ministers rather than at her. And of course Elizabeth's ministers themselves were changing. As Elizabeth's original ministers died, Dudley in 88, Walsingham in 90, and Burghley in 98, they were replaced by a new, younger, and more disloyal generation. It is notable that both Robert Cecil and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, were secretly trying to secure the succession while publicly serving the Queen. The most powerful example of this disloyalty is the Earl of Essex's rebellion in 1601. Elizabeth had long indulged Essex's arrogance and allowed him to become a rival for popularity. Essex's success in dealing with the Spanish fleet at Cadiz in 1596 made him a hero, especially in London, so much so that celebrations of it were banned. Elizabeth showed poor judgment in appointing Essex to Ireland. He had already had engravings made of himself as a Roman emperor, and had turned his back on the Queen, leading to her boxing his ears, and even half drawn his sword on her in 1598. In Ireland, Essex was predictably disloyal and ineffective. Elizabeth showed typical caution and indecision after his unauthorised return. She banned him from court, refused to renew his monopoly on sweet wines, but did not arrest or execute him. Essex's rebellion, when it came in 1601, was potentially serious. He had the support of 5 nobles. He had support from the Earl of Tyrone, and possibly even from James VI. On the day of his rebellion, Essex and his soldiers were just 2 miles from the Queen. However, the heralds cried treason. London did not rise, and within 12 hours Essex was surrounded in Essex House. The failure of his rebellion and his subsequent execution could be said to be evidence of Elizabeth's continuing effectiveness. However, they show the extent to which she had lost control of faction. Her council had become, in Christopher Haig's words, dangerously narrow and weak, with only 11 privy councillors by 1597, of whom 5 were sons of former members. With Essex gone, she threw in her lot with the Sicilians, and there was considerable anger at Essex's execution. Elizabeth dealt with Essex's rebellion as she dealt with all the rebellions that she faced, and ultimately she died of old age. However, Essex's rebellion represents just one of a number of challenges to the royal prerogative, the existing traditional rights of the monarch, in the final decade of her reign. For example, the monopolies crisis was a challenge from Parliament on a matter of state, but it was resolved relatively easily. Probably the biggest long-term challenge to the royal prerogative came in the weakening of the monarch's financial position. Elizabeth's failure to reform meant that the Crown was increasingly reliant on parliamentary subsidy taxes for ordinary spending. Although this weakness was not really exploited by Elizabeth's parliaments, she was never denied funds, it became an issue for her Stuart successors. Elizabeth's weakening financial situation mirrored growing economic and social problems in her final years. The war with Spain exacerbated the problems caused by bad harvests between 1594 and 1597. Food prices rose quickly, and there were food riots in the south in 1595. The Oxfordshire Rising in 1596 shows that they were easily dealt with. Only 4 rebels actually turned up, but the problems were serious enough for new poor laws to be introduced in 1598. Given these problems, it's worth considering the Queen's image and reputation at the end of her reign. The cult of Gloriana had reached its peak in the 1590s. Spenser wrote poems of the Fairy Queen. Elizabeth was compared to the goddess Diana, and her beauty and virginity were celebrated in the ever-youthful portraits with their symbolic scythes and thornless roses. The same image was being promoted until the end of her reign. However, it was increasingly ridiculous. There was war and revolt. She was old and ugly. No longer was her virginity to be celebrated as the country lacked an heir. She was to many a bad-tempered spinster. In 1602, Harrington, her godson, described her as a lady shut up in a chamber from her subjects, while the historian Christopher Haig describes her as an irascible old woman. Elizabeth's poor judgment and failure to reform had created considerable problems at the end of her reign, and she was similarly unable to reform her image. She lived by her motto, semper idem, always the same. However, much of the anger was directed at Robert Cecil rather than at her. The end of her reign saw victory in Ireland, a truce with Spain, trade recovering and better harvests. Haig claims that Elizabeth died unloved and almost unlamented. By contrast, a contemporary account by John Stowe describes unknown sighing, groaning and weeping at her funeral. David Starkey claims few monarchs have been better loved by their subjects. When it comes to the popularity and effectiveness of Elizabeth's government at the end of the reign, you need to have a clear and supported view of your own.